Good morning, everyone. Hope you all enjoyed your weekend. Weather was really nice. Hope you had a chance to get outside and enjoy it. All right, today we're going to finish up Chapter 13, America in Turmoil, 1960 to 1980. Today we're going to cover Part 4, the post-Watergate years. Now, with Nixon gone, America now had to move forward. I remember President Ford gave this speech on TV, "My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over." Ford was going to become the healing president after all the turmoil of the Watergate years. All right, so with the resignation of Nixon, Gerald R. Ford is our 38th president. He went by the name of Jerry. Jerry Ford is our only president from Michigan. Now, Ford was born Leslie Lynch King Jr., that was his name, back on July 14th, 1913 in Omaha, Nebraska. Now, his parents divorced within the year. He never even knew his father. His mother remarried to a man named Gerald Ford, who was a really good stepfather to young Jerry. Jerry even later took his name. Ford joined the Boy Scouts and rose to Eagle Scout. He's the only president of the United States ever to be an Eagle Scout. He attended the University of Michigan, where he played varsity football. Ford was a Michigan fan to the day he died. In fact, there was stories where they would actually play the University of Michigan fight song instead of the traditional "Hail to the Chiefs" when Ford would enter the room. That's how much Ford loved Michigan. And without a doubt, Ford was our most athletic president. He helped the Wolverines to 2 undefeated seasons and national titles in 1932 and 1933. He graduated in 1934. He turned down offers to play professional football with the Detroit Lions and the Green Bay Packers, though it's not the NFL what we see today. There wasn't a lot of money in it, but he turned them down. He joined the Navy after Pearl Harbor. He served in the Pacific on an aircraft carrier on board the USS Monterey. After the war, Ford married Elizabeth Bloomer, though she went by the name Betty. Betty and Jerry would stay married to the end of their lives. In 1948, he ran for Congress and he won. He actually served in the United States House of Representatives from 1949 to 1973. That's 24 years. He was elected 12 consecutive times. He became the House Minority Leader in 1965 and actually remained there, till he left the House of Representatives to become Vice President after the resignation of Spiro Agnew. Now we're going to talk about the Ford administration. Ford deals with problems the entire time while he's president. People were still unhappy with him because of the Nixon pardon. The economy goes into a recession after Vietnam, and inflation becomes a major concern. Prices in the supermarkets and elsewhere just keep going up. Now, Ford's plan to reduce inflation was called WIN, Whip Inflation Now. People even got these little buttons to wear, as you can see here. The idea was to get people to reduce spending and consumption. If we don't buy as much, prices start to come down. But that's going to depend on people doing it, and it's just not going to work. Unemployment then started to go up too, and that becomes a major problem. Nothing worked. The economy continued to get worse. In 1975, I remember this hit the newspapers. 1975, Ford got into a dispute over a federal bailout for New York City, prompting the Daily News' famous headline, "Ford to City, Drop Dead." He was actually fighting with the mayor of New York City, Abe Beame, at the time, because New York City was facing bankruptcy. And Ford decided he wasn't going to help them out. Didn't make him very popular in New York City either. But however, Ford was an outspoken supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment. This was the amendment that would guarantee that women had the same equal rights as men. Unfortunately, it did fail. Didn't get enough state support. But Ford was somebody who came out to speak for it. Now, we're a little delay. Here we go. Now, I remember this so well. I was 16 years old. July 4th, 1976, the country celebrates the bicentennial. This was huge. This was the country got caught up in celebrating our 200th anniversary since the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I remember this. You remember, my wife, you remember this too, right?
They had the tall ships.
The tall ships. I have a picture right here showing the tall ships.
We went on my roof and watched it because I live right up the block.
Well, I was living in Weehawken at the time, and we all just went down to the cliffs, and we we watched those tall ships, the big sailing ships. You see them sailing here to New York Harbor. You see the World's Trade Center in the background. That had just been completed only a few years earlier, the brand new Twin Towers. This was the logo from the American Revolution. This was on everything that year. And the tall ships known as Op Sail. And we got a chance to go into the city, and you got to go on the boats and see them, and it was really, really cool. Everyone got very excited about it. I remember the mobs in Weehawken on the cliffs watching the ships come in. They were mobbed in Bayonne, Jersey City, Hoboken, over in Manhattan. It was a huge thing. Okay, getting a lot of pauses here. All right. Now, Ford has to run for his first election. This is the election of 1976. So, the Republicans choose him to run again. He, again, they keep Ronald Reagan off the ticket. It becomes a very close, narrow race, but in the end, Ford does win. Now, to run against Ford, the Democrats choose an outsider, Jimmy Carter. He was not a inside politician from Washington, D.C., like Ford, who spent 24 years in the House of Representatives. Carter was the governor of Georgia. He never was served in Washington, D.C. So they liked the idea that he was an outsider, not part of the system. He chooses as his running mate Walter Mondale of Minnesota. Now, Carter was a peanut farmer before he was governor, so he was a relatively unknown. And as I said, he campaigned as a Washington outsider, so not part of the system. Now, in the election, Ford was hurt by a poor economy and the Nixon pardon. All right, a lot of people are still very angry at him. Here we have the campaign buttons again. Carter was seen as a Washington outsider, and this made him very popular. And you can see from the button here, this became a big thing. The peanut and his big smile. In fact, he was a peanut farmer, and he had that big grin. So this becomes very, very popular in the election. Okay, so Carter wins the election. It's very close, though, 297 to 240. All right, this is a photograph here of Carter's inaugural parade. After being sworn in and taking the oath of office and giving his inaugural address at the Capitol building, they proceed in a procession up Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. Everyone stays in their limousine. But Carter stops his limousine, and him and his wife Rosalind and their young daughter Amy, you see here, get out of the car and they walk, waving to the crowd, showing he's a man of people, which everyone loved. This was like the first time I believe it was ever done. Yeah. And probably drove the Secret Service crazy because now the security, now the president's out in the open, so someone could take a shot at him. So it must have driven them crazy. But now we see today presidents still keep doing this, and getting out to walk. So it becomes a kind of a tradition. Now in the election, Ford carries more states, as you can see here in the map, 27 states to 23. But Carter won the popular vote by 2%. Now here's the problem. I'll show you this. Let me get a color here. I don't know what color I can pick. Here, blue maybe will work. Look at these states up here. All right? He wins all these states in the Midwest. Republicans keep doing this, but the states don't have a lot of electoral votes. The Dakotas, 3, 4, Wyoming, 3, Montana, 4, Idaho, 4, Utah, 4. So they don't win a lot of electoral votes. The big states you can see here, Carter won, were Texas, New York, Florida. All right. Traditional Democratic states like California and Illinois went for Ford. So this it's a little bit different here. So than we see today. All right, Amy, let me erase this. Circle there, and let's move on. Now, Carter remains the only Democrat since 1964 to win a majority of southern states. Even today, the southern states go Republican. Remember Nixon's southern strategy? And southern states, which had been Democrat since the Civil War, are now almost solidly Republican. Though some presidents, President Obama carried a number of southern states, a couple of them, but no one since Carter has carried the majority of them. Now, after leaving the White House, Betty and Jerry Ford stayed involved. Carter and Ford, after Carter left the White House 4 years later, when he's not reelected, Carter and Ford become very good friends, and they work well together doing charity things. Now, in 2001, Ford broke with the conservative members of the Republican Party by stating that gay and lesbian couples, quote, ought to be treated equally, period. All right, this went against the Republicans who were very not into gay rights. Now, Ford turns 90 in 2003. And here we see a picture of Ford, Jerry Ford and his wife, Betty, with President George W. Bush and his wife, Laura, in the White House celebrating his 90th party. They got a big cake there. All right, so let's talk about Jimmy Carter. He actually was James Earl Carter, but he refused to go by James, and everyone called him Jimmy. He was our 39th president and our only president born in Georgia. Now, he was born on October 1st, 1924, in Plains, Georgia. He's the first president to be born in a hospital. Now, that might sound very strange to us today when everyone's born in hospitals, but not back in the 1910s and 20s. So he was born in a hospital. In fact, his mother, Lillian, was a nurse there. This is a later picture. Miss Lillian became very popular. Remember that?
Miss Lillian.
Yes, Miss Lillian. She became very popular when during the election and after Carter won. His brother, Billy, was very popular too, but it wasn't.
For all the wrong reasons.
For all the wrong reasons. Billy was a real Southern good old boy who really enjoyed his beer and,
Yeah, and getting into scraps.
And getting into trouble, and it became
stupid trouble.
Yeah, stupid trouble, dumb stuff.
Nothing bad.
No scandals. It was just like,
your old drunken uncle.
Yeah,
that's what it was. He's a drunk.
He was, they'd get pictures of him drinking beer and then going to the woods and peeing on a tree, and they have videos. So it was.
When you're president,
when you're president, but Billy. It was more of a humorous thing. People say, "Oh, what's Billy doing now?"
What's Billy doing now?
Right.
Yeah,
so
Billy Beer, remember?
And they came out with Billy Beer too. So yeah, Billy. Yeah. Okay. Billy, for 4 years, he was. People like to travel around and take, video of him.
And it was a Carter's like, oh God, what's he doing now?
Now Carter himself grew up during the Great Depression. While he was in high school, he played on the high school basketball team. Now, he attended the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. This is the Army's version, like the Army has West Point, the Navy has Annapolis. He's the only president of the United States to actually attend Annapolis. He would graduate in 1946, but while he was in Annapolis, he played on their sprint football team. Sprint football team, we still have it today. It's mostly a
for smaller body people.
Smaller body people.
It's like a weight.
Mr. Matthews played sprint football at Rutgers.
My college has sprint.
Yeah, so Chestnut Hills is a sprint football team. We've had a few of our alumni go off and play there.
And they're smaller.
Because they're not huge people. So and Carter he's the only president to actually play sprint football. Now, after graduation, Carter married Rosalind Smith. There they are. And she would stay his wife, and they still are both together today. Yeah, they're all alive. Mm-hmm. Now, while in the Navy, This was right after World War II. He graduated 1 year after the end of World War II. So Carter isn't actually, they put him down to some veteran things, but he actually didn't serve in World War II. But while he was in the Navy, he served on submarines. All right, he's our only president to actually serve on submarines. He began an association with the U.S. Navy's fledgling nuclear submarine program, and he studied nuclear power. He was sent off and he studied it, and this was going to be his career. But his plan to stay in the Navy changed when his father died in 1953. So he left active service to run the family peanut business in Georgia. So after leaving the Navy, he becomes a peanut farmer. Here we are shoveling the peanuts. It's kind of funny when you think of peanuts and you get those bags of peanuts, but they all have to be grown. And there are farms down south that grow peanuts. And Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer. But he also entered politics while he was down there. He didn't make a lot of money in the very beginning. In fact, him and Rosalind lived in public housing. He's the only president of the United States to actually live in public housing until he was able to make some money. His father didn't leave. His father actually had a lot of money, but there were so many relatives, he divided among everyone. So even though George and Rosalind were getting the peanut farm, they really didn't get a lot of money. So it took a while for them to start building up the money. So, actually living in public housing, this is something unique for a president. So he enters politics, and he runs for governor in 1971, and he wins. Again, the big smile. 5 years later, he's elected president of the United States. And there he is with Walter Mondale. So Carter had a really quick rise up. And that smile, that was the winning smile. All right, so let's talk about the Carter administration. Now, there were a lot of positive things. Excuse me. One of probably the biggest things that occurred while he was president was in 1978, the Camp David Accords. He gets Israel and Egypt to sign a peace treaty, and it'll end 30 years of hostilities. Started in 1948 when Israel became a country, and they had the Israeli, the war, 1948 war between Israel, fought against Iraq, Syria, Transjordan, and Egypt. So there were a number of wars after that. So Israel and Egypt were always fighting wars against each other. Egypt was determined to destroy Israel. And this was always a problem. And Carter is going to start to bring about the end, or bring some peace to the Middle East. So he brings the leaders of the two countries, Anwar Sadat, he's the man on the left, from Egypt, and Israeli's minister Menachem Begin on the right. They go to Camp David, which is the presidential retreat in Virginia, and they work on a treaty together, and he finally gets them to come together, and the peace is still, in fact, in place today. The following year, Carter and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev, you see there he is on the right. Remember the guy with the big eyebrows? You can still see him even in this picture. Look at those eyebrows. But anyway, they signed SALT II. If you remember, Nixon signed SALT I. This is SALT II. It slows the arms race. Now, it had been started actually by Ford in 1972. And it's called the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which will place limits on multiple warhead capacities. We're trying to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons both countries have. Now, Carter did not have a good relationship with Congress. It was very adversarial. Remember, Carter ran as an outsider. And that means he didn't really have any friends in Congress that he could kind of rely on. And probably the top Democrat in Congress was Ted Kennedy. As you see, he's the man with the dark suit. Him and Carter didn't get along. Kennedy wanted to be president himself. His brother John was president. Bobby had been assassinated when he was running for president. So Ted Kennedy wants to become president. He never will. But he saw Carter as the man standing in his way. So the two of them never really got along. Now, Carter was also unable to handle the continuing recession. There was high inflation. In fact, we got a new term called stagflation. It's when the economy was very stagnant and the inflation kept going up. So we created this new word, stagflation. Usually when the inflation goes up, unemployment goes down. It's kind of an inverse relationship. But for whatever reason, both of them were going up. So we had higher unemployment and higher inflation, which was really destroying the economy. And to make it even worse for Carter, in 1979, we have the energy crisis. There's an oil shortage. Gasoline shortages start appearing around the country. This was caused because there was and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, a revolution in Iran, which caused a decrease in oil production. Less decreases, brings prices up. But it was worse than that because now there's not enough gasoline to go around. Stations started running out of gas. There were long gas lines. They used to stretch for blocks. And then they came up with odd and even days, depending on if your license plate started with an odd number or an even number. That's the day you could go and buy gas. So it was so bad that they actually started to consider gas rationing, like they had in World War II. So it was really, really bad, and it just made everyone very upset. And Carter, and of course, these were external things, so Carter can do nothing about it. Now, in December of 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. This is going to start a 9-year war. The Soviet military was very strong. You see the tanks, you see armored carriers. They also had these big helicopters, gunships that had heavily armored weapons. So they had this massive military, and they invade Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan doesn't have any military pretty much. They have the Afghan rebels called the Mujahideen, you see here. And since they don't fight a conventional war against the Soviets are forced to fight a guerrilla war against them. Now, the Mujahideen, as you can see here, are mostly just these rebels who fought up in the mountains of Afghanistan. They didn't have very, big weapons. You see a lot of like old rifles they were fighting against and riding horses against the Soviet machine. But they started to be getting new weapons from the United States. The United States started backing the Mujahideen groups to fight against the Soviets. Keep in mind, the Cold War is still going on, and will go on for another 10 years or so. And the Soviets had backed the North Vietnamese against us, so now it's our turn to start backing the Afghan rebels against the Soviet Union. So we started giving them these surface-to-air missiles. They could shoot down those gunships. They could destroy the Soviet tanks. And the war would go on for 9 years. Here we go. The war will contribute to the fall of the Soviet Union. Basically, it undermined the image of the Red Army as invincible. They're going to spend 9 years fighting against the Mujahideen, and they don't win. And they're going to lose a lot of soldiers and spend a lot of resources there, and they're going to have nothing to show for it. So this kind of really hurts their image. An interesting side note is the future 9/11 terrorist Osama bin Laden fought with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. He wasn't Afghan himself. He was actually Saudi Arabian, but he had gone to Afghanistan to fight with the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. Now, in March of 1979, there's a nuclear disaster at 3 Mile Island. The 3 Mile Island was a nuclear power plant. You can see these are the iconic cooling towers that we always associate with nuclear power plants. 3 Mile Island power plant is right outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the capital of Pennsylvania. There was a partial meltdown of a reactor at the 3 Mile Island plant that allowed large amounts of nuclear reactor coolant to escape as steam into the atmosphere, and it caused a lot of fear that this thing could, explode or poison the area. So Carter did go there with his wife, Rosalind. Now, keep in mind, Carter studied nuclear power when he was in the Navy, so he did have an understanding of what the power plant, what happens in power plants. So here he is in the reactor room. This is the control room, I should say, where they control the reactors and being told what happened. Now, this is going to lead to anti-nuclear protests that hurt the nuclear industry. All right, people, have been always afraid of nuclear power, and 3 Mile Island made people even more afraid. Now, no one actually got sick from the radiation poisoning as the result of the accident, but it slowed down the building of new nuclear reactors. People didn't want to have them near them. To make it even worse, there was another nuclear disaster in Russia in 1986. There was actually an explosion, a nuclear explosion at the Chernobyl plant in the USSR. Today it's the modern country of Ukraine. The explosion killed 28 people, and it actually closed the nearby city of Pripyat. I think I'm pronouncing it that way. Pripyat. It was actually a city that had 50,000 people. Most of them worked at the power plant. Because of the explosion and all the radioactivity, it poisoned an entire area of 100 square miles that the city of Pripyat was in, and the people had to evacuate. They were all told to get onto buses, and they were all left. They had to leave their homes behind, everything. So today the city is totally empty. This was the amusement park. I mean, nothing goes on. Everything is as it was, but nobody could go in there because the city. I hear now that people are starting to move in because the radioactivity level is starting to go down, but it still has a high level of radioactivity that it's not really good for people to go into. So after first 3 Mile Island in 1979 and Chernobyl in 1986, people really distrust nuclear power as being a safe source of energy. And they actually still do today. You don't see nuclear power plants being built anymore, except in France, because they take a lot more care to make sure they're safe. But in the United States, we don't really see a lot of emphasis on nuclear power. Now I want to talk about probably the most major event of the Carter administration, which pretty much destroyed his presidency, and that was the Iranian hostage crisis. Now, back in 1953, during the height of the Cold War, Iran had a leader that was democratically elected, but he was seen as being too cozy with the communists in Moscow. So the CIA, with the help of the British MI6, which is their version of CIA, organized an overthrow of the elected leader of Iran in a coup. And they put in the US-friendly Shah of Iran. He was a brutal dictator that would spend the next, 26 years imprisoning and torturing Iranians. It's really terrible living under this dictator. Now, in 1979, Muslim fundamentalists lead a revolution in Iran. They actually overthrow the Shah, who is actually forced to leave the country. He will leave, and first he goes to Egypt, where he'll spend time in exile there. Now, the Islamic cleric, the Ayatollah Khomeini, was the new leader of Iran. This guy is definitely not friendly toward America. The whole Islamic fundamentalist Iranian regime under the Ayatollah is very anti-American. They somehow get their hands on lots of American flags just for the sole purpose of burning them in front of television cameras. So we see this constant anti-American protest. Now, on November 4th, 1979, Khomeini's followers, these were mostly college students who used to protest in front of the Iranian embassy, burning flags all the time, of course, with the help of the Islamic government. They actually climbed the walls and seized the U.S. embassy in Tehran. This was all over the news. something had never been done before, actually seizing an American embassy. Now, the Iranians were angry that the Shah of Iran, who had been living in Egypt, had cancer, and Carter allowed the Shah to come to America for cancer treatments. Carter didn't like the Shah, but he felt it was a humanitarian thing to let him come and get cancer treatments. Probably, in hindsight, wasn't a smart move. Now, it was very frustrating to Carter. They were negotiating with the Iranian governments. The Iranian governments in the very beginning saying there was nothing they can do about it. These were students. It wasn't even part of their government. So it made it very difficult for Carter because it was very hard who to deal with. And he couldn't get their release. They actually attempted a military operation in April of 1980. They sent in 8 helicopters, Army helicopters. They took off from the USS Nimitz, an aircraft carrier, nuclear-powered aircraft carrier that was in the Persian Gulf. The plan was just to land in an abandoned airstrip out in the middle of the desert, refuel the helicopters, then fly onto the embassy in Tehran, grab our hostages, and then fly out. Unfortunately, there was a terrible sandstorm out in the desert. A couple of the planes were disabled. 2 of the helicopters actually ended up colliding on the ground, bursting into fire. They didn't have enough helicopters to complete the mission. 8 American servicemen were killed. So it was a total disaster. It was an embarrassment to the U.S. government and to the Carter administration. 2 months later, the Shah of Iran dies, so they can't even bargain with him anymore. It was very frustrating. Everyone in America, I remember this stuff. It was, I was in college at the time. CNN, ABC, Nightline on ABC, Ted Koppel here. Every day they talked about the hostages. They would put up there day 100, America held hostage, day 200, day 300, day 400. It went on over a year, and Carter couldn't do anything about it. He tried, and the negotiations, they were so angry at Carter and the Americans, they just were not going to release them. Finally, after those 444 days, Carter negotiates the release of the hostage. He had already been defeated for re-election. The hostage situation became a primary part of the election of 1980. So he was pretty much on the way, getting ready to leave the White House. Ronald Reagan was getting ready to move in. And right at the very end, in January of 1981, they do negotiate a release of the hostages. And they do come home. And here they are, welcome back to freedom. They're coming off the airplane, waving to everyone. Carter wanted to meet him, but unfortunately, the Iranians worked it out, the timing, so that Carter couldn't go there and see him because it was the inauguration for Ronald Reagan, and being the former president, he had to be there for it. So the Iranians did everything they could to embarrass Carter. Now, the economy, stagflation, the oil crisis, and the hostage crisis really led to a low period in America during the 1970s. We were very down. It was just a real bad period for us that we felt really bad because things just were not going well in this country. There was, however, one bright spot in February of 1980 before the military disaster, before crashed in the desert. There was one period where the U.S. Olympic hockey team defeats the powerhouse Soviet Union, and this really gave America a lift, a chance of USA, USA, USA. We had these college students, did you see here in the picture, who came together under a college coach named Herb Brooks to play in the Olympics against the powerhouse Army, the Soviet Army hockey team that had won, I think, 5 or 6 consecutive gold medals. Only a week earlier, they played an exhibition game against the Americans and beat them 10-3. So it was just like this. They call it the miracle on ice. Here it is. The miracle on ice that we could ever have beaten the Soviet Union, and we did. We pulled it off. We won 4-3. I remember watching this game on TV, and it was so exciting. Everyone in America was out cheering, waving American flags, chanting USA. This really lifted up our spirits. America was now about to become more conservative. Now, the last thing I want to mention, it occurred during the Carter administration, and that was the Mount St. Helens eruption. Mount St. Helens is out in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. It's in the state of Washington. It's about 90 miles south of Seattle, 60 miles north of Portland, Oregon. It was an area with campgrounds, and people would go there to go camping and hunting, fishing. There was a kind of a lodge that people could stay in, with rooms. They're right in a place called Spirit Lake, right at the base of the mountain where you can go fishing. It was really a nice campground area. All right. Now, on May 18th, 1980, Mount St. Helens, which really was a volcano, erupted. It exploded. There was an earthquake, and the whole north face of the mountain slid down and collapsed, exploding the whole top. They actually, 1,280 feet of the top of the mountain is gone. It created a crater, a volcanic crater, almost 2 miles wide. It had the power, they said, 1,600 times the power of the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. That was how much power the explosion of the volcano. It killed 57 people, including some of the one of the famous geologists who was there monitoring, who was killed. And it destroyed about 230 square miles. Whole forest, as you can see here, just flattened. It was estimated that 7,000 bears, elk, deer were killed, along with millions of smaller animals, rabbits, chipmunks, fish. It destroyed about, 27 bridges, 200 homes, about 185 miles of roads. It caused major flooding because it was a snow-capped mountain, being it was May, but because of the volcano and the heat, all the snow instantly melted. All this water rushed down, carrying dirt. The rivers were flooded. It just wiped out bridges. It was just devastating. You can see cars here that had been, totally covered in mud, and it just devastated the whole area. Now, I got a chance to visit with my wife back about 10 years ago, and we got to visit Mount St. Helens, and it's slowly recovering, all right? After 40 years, animal and plant life is returning. I got this picture here. This is actually all that gray was all in it's like some places 20, 30 feet deep of just volcanic ash. But you can see here plants starting to grow out of the ash. Spirit Lake is still clogged with trees that had blown down, but slowly it's coming back. But it's an interesting place. Now it's in a National Historic Forest. You can go and see it. They have a building there where you can go inside. It's like a museum. They show you what happened. It's fascinating. But slowly, Mount Washington is coming back to life. Okay, so that's it. This was the post-Watergate era, the administrations of Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. So I hope you learned a little something about it, got something out of it, and I will enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you tomorrow. We're almost done here. Tomorrow we're going to do the conservative years, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, and then after that we're going to talk about Bill Clinton and George W. Bush and the election of Barack Obama. So we're almost at the end. Okay? Take care.